continuation's cut there, but charismatic or continuationism versus cessationalism. So cessationalism is, you think of the word cessation or cease, the stopping of. They believe the gifts are gone out of the church. All right, so we're going to, go back and forth on that. This is really a semantic argument, meaning that they're talking about the root of what gifts mean. They believe the gifts, they don't really define the gifts well. If you ask, I've asked a handful of them, what do you think the gifts are? They all have different answers. But whatever they think the gifts are, they believe that those no longer exist in the church since the time of the apostles, or at least the establishment of the canon. And they believe the manifestations we see today are not gifts, but rather are answered prayers, or some sort of human power, or a natural healing, or a non-sign healing. I mean, there's no such thing as God healing someone naturally. Anytime God intervenes, it's a supernatural healing, right? Whether it's slow or fast. But I think the point they're trying to get to, and they say that it's natural or a non-sign, is that it's maybe something slower. It's not going to be like super in your face the way the Bible had it. Or they'll just call it demonic power, and they've got all sorts of variety. They've got all sorts of varieties of people with certain types of faith in these churches. Some of them are just like, you tell them, oh yeah, I've seen someone so-and-so healed of cancer, or I've seen whatever miracle, and they'll believe it. Some of them will just deny it. So there's a wide range of people just saying like, yeah, I believe you, but that's just not a gift. That's just God answering a prayer. Or I just don't believe you. And I've seen that entire range of those sorts of people in these churches. As far as historical support for this, there is none. This was established in the 1500s by John Calvin. And if we remember Calvinism, this is determinism. This is God determines everything that happens. God determines all good, all evil. God is the author and root of all evil. So this was rooted in Calvin basically just saying, well, if I pray and someone's not healed, then God decided not to heal them. And it's completely determined by God. And so I don't see gifts happening, therefore I don't believe the gifts happen anymore, or else that God would have determined that. So it's very much rooted, it's very much from that Calvinistic view. It's also rooted in inexperience. Calvin, for example, read Augustine. Augustine's a church father from the 400s, very, very influential, especially in the Catholic Church. And Augustine was deterministic, and not nearly as much as Calvin, but he was deterministic in that he actually was a Gnostic before he was a Christian. And Augustine brought in some of the deterministic views of Gnosticism into Christianity. And I think his view of predestination that Calvin adopted was really a Gnostic view, and not so much a Christian view. It didn't come from the church fathers before him, and it's really not the view that Christianity has ever held until Calvinism came around. And so in these Calvinist or Reformed churches, you see cessationalism a lot. And not to confuse Reformed churches with the Reformation. Calvin and Calvinism was born in the Reformation, but there were a lot of non-Calvinistic, non-deterministic, non-reformed reformers in the Reformation. So they don't represent all of the Reformation's thoughts. Lutheranism and the Anabaptists, for example, and there were other groups that were so Calvinism was a small group within the Protestant Reformation movement. As far as scripture, they don't really have any to support this. 1 Corinthians 13, quite questionable as far as whether that supports this view or not. And to have one passage that's very vague to support your view is not worth putting a doctrine in. There's rules of hermeneutics, which are rules of Bible interpretation. And one of the rules is, I'll use two rules. One rule is you use clear passages to interpret vague passages. If you're like, this passage is kind of vague, what about other passages on this topic and what do they have to say? So if 1 Corinthians 13 is a little bit vague, what does the rest of the Bible say? Well, there's a lot of passages talking about the gifts being in the church and in the church age. So if we were to use those clear verses to interpret 1 Corinthians 13, we do not end with cessationalism. Also, there's a hermeneutic rule saying you need, two or more witnesses, so two or more solid scriptures that actually outline a doctrine to build the doctrine. And obviously, one vague passage does not support this. So this is very, very, very much a non-biblical view, not supported by the Bible. I mean, they'll have other verses that they pull in, like, the signs were involved with the apostles. Like, yeah, the apostles had signs in their ministry. That That doesn't say anything else but other than that the apostles had signs in their ministry. That doesn't mean there was going to cease. It doesn't mean that there was going to be not going to be signs in anyone else's ministry. It doesn't mean any of that. So they just don't have scripture support at all. 1 Corinthians 13 says, so this is that very famous passage about love. And at the end of it, it goes, love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away with. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. So what is this perfect and partial? And what is this knowing in part and knowing in whole? If you read in context, 12 through 14, this is about the supremacy and eternal benefits of love, contrasted against the temporary benefits of the gifts. For example, the body can be healed, but the person will eventually die. But the love you put into that person's life is eternal, and the love you put out in the world is eternal, and also has eternal repercussions on your eternity and their eternity. And so it's about the supremacy of love compared to the temporary nature of the gifts and what the gifts bring. But Paul still continues to encourage the gifts right there at the end of the chapter. So he's saying, look, the gifts are great. Go after. He actually says 3 times in this book, eagerly pursue the spiritual gifts. 3 times. Eagerly pursue the spiritual gifts. But I'll show you a greater thing. Love is greater. So it's saying, look, this is important. Go after it. But make sure that your priorities are straight. That love is supreme. That's the point of this. So he's saying, and it goes on in the chapter, he's explaining that now we see dimly, but then we'll see clearly. Well, when is the then? They're actually thinking that's the canon, but it's actually about eternity. It's about when we're in heaven, when we're in the resurrection, we're going to see clearly everything. So this is very much about eternity versus temporary things, earthly versus heavenly things. Okay, the gifts are really focused on our earth ministry. They build up the church, and they're useful in the church in a more earthly sense in that the knowledge, information, and healed bodies that we get through these gifts are earthly things. The knowledge we get in prophecy and in words of knowledge are earthly knowledge, and they're not full, they're not complete. We don't have a complete view of anything in the world, but in eternity we will have a completeness. And so love is eternal, therefore that is the higher priority because we're only working with partial things in this world. So what are the gifts? Remember, this is a semantic argument, right? So this is like, they're just saying, look, at least the ones that are quite believing, not the unbelieving ones, but the ones that are believing of manifestations and healings and prophecies and knowledge from God existing in the church, they're just going to say it's not a gift, but it's just an answer to prayer, for example. Or it's just God doing things. But this is about, so the question isn't so much about whether they believe that God is doing these things as much as what they're going to label them. So it almost dissolves into kind of a not important issue when you get there. But I think it's important that their churches don't see these manifestations the way that the other churches do and the way that the believing churches do. The way that the churches that actually function in these things, we see a lot more healings and prophecies and fiery ministry with words of the Spirit moving forward. And I think that, that matters. I think your doctrine matters. This is a doctrine that I really believe affects your ministry in your life. And it might even be the difference between life or death for some people who need healing. Very much so. So Baker's Encyclopedia of the Bible, I took a snippet of it that really, I think, embodies what this is. Charisma, meaning expression or manifestations or embodiment of grace, and then pneumatikon, meaning expression or manifestations or embodiment of the Spirit. So in other words, it's a manifestation of grace and a manifestation of the Spirit. These are the words that are the gifts. In 1 Corinthians 12, I took just a few clips of that chapter because it goes through a long list of the gifts, which isn't the important part of the chapter, actually. It does list the gifts, and so we know we have a list of, these supernatural things, but the emphasis of the chapter is something quite different. And I think that when we understand the emphasis of the chapter, we'll understand the point of the chapter and what it's actually saying. So the first verse is, now concerning the spiritual gifts. Now, gifts is in parentheses in my New American Standard Bible. Italics, because it's not in the Greek. spirituals is pneumatikon, which means a manifestation of the Spirit. So concerning the manifestations of the Spirit. So, but, we understand this he's talking about the gifts because that's what the chapter's about, right? Brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. So right from the start, he's just saying, I'm going to talk about the manifestations of the Spirit. That's what this chapter is about, okay? He goes on to say in verse 4, there's a variety of gifts. Now we got charisma gifts. That's manifestations of grace. But the same Spirit, pneuma, right? Pneumatikon versus pneuma. So manifestations of the Spirit. So just some snippets here. Verse 5. He starts going through the list of gifts. There's prophecy, there's words of knowledge, but the same Lord. Okay? The same God works all things in all people. He goes through more. There's healing, there's tongues through the Spirit, according to the same Spirit. Verse 9. Again, more gifts listed by the same Spirit. More gifts listed by one Spirit. Okay? So, same Lord, same God, through the Spirit, according to the same Spirit, by the one Spirit. What's the point? He's listing the gifts and repeating, by the Spirit, by the Spirit. The point is, it's by the Spirit. So, he's talking to a Greek audience, and they were used to different gods having different functions. So he's saying, I want you to understand the manifestations of the Spirit. All these gifts, I'm going to list this gift and this gift, they're all by the Spirit of God. This gift and this gift and this gift, by the Spirit of God. This gift and this gift and this gift, by the Spirit of God. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually just as he wills. So one interpretation that the cessationalists would take from this passage is God was giving certain people certain gifts. He's distributing, this person's a healer, this person's a prophet, this person gets word of knowledge, this person does this, and this person does that. I do not believe that's what this chapter is saying, and I don't believe that that's how the gifts work. What the gifts are is they are manifestations of the Spirit and grace. They're not people getting a gift. They're not gifted people. The gifts are not people being gifted. The gifts are the Spirit manifesting something through believers. That's what the gifts are. So it's a manifestation of the Spirit. The gift is simply the Spirit is doing something through a person. That is what a gift is. Okay? And that is what the meaning of the words are. And that is what the Scripture shows us. Paul says 3 times the gifts must be eagerly pursued. He's saying eagerly pursue these gifts. This means that just like any task, skill, hobby, sport, or job, the gifts require practice, patience, and personal investment. Hence why the sick go to the elders in James 5:14, because the elders have practiced it. They have sought the gifts. They're the people, if you're sick, you go to an elder because they're the ones who are this close to God and have invested their time in fasting and prayer and getting close to God and the doctrine and renewing their mind to faith. This also means the process is not entirely determined by God. The people have to pursue the gifts. So there is a responsibility on the people there. It's not a deterministic thing. So the way I pursued the healing ministry, for example, was I bought books, I bought lessons, I specifically picked all the scriptures. I literally have a list of all of Jesus' miracles. Combed through them all. Read all the scriptures of Jesus' miracles. All the apostles' miracles. Made a list of it. Went through every single one. What did they do? How did they minister to these people? And what were they doing? What were they saying? I went through every passage about Jesus teaching about how to pray. You pray believing that what you're asking for has been given to you, and then it will be given to you. So you have to already believe that what you're asking for is answered. The answer's already there. You have to actually believe that way. That's what Jesus says. So I had to train my brain. I would pace my house, up and down the hallway of my house. When I pray, I'm believing. And if I'll pray, and then I'll imagine that person being healed because I'm believing that is the answer that's going to be given. So I'm training my brain to be in faith. And as he just said, that was a great point. As you go through the ministry, I started laying hands and praying for people. And as you go through the ministry, the Spirit guides you and teaches you. So I started to learn kind of this groove of how to inspire faith in people in a short conversation. How to open up someone respectfully and kindly to let me pray for them and lay hands on them, So you kind of, you get the Spirit and you go through this walk and journey. And so rather than just saying the gifts don't exist, and I'm just going to pray a prayer and hope God answers and still be scared that maybe God won't answer. Rather, I'm renewing my mind to believe for it, expect the answer, have confidence in God for it. And again, your doctrine is very important to this. And so it's learning the scripture on it. I memorized a bunch of scriptures in healing, and when I ministered to people, I would use those scriptures that I had memorized. And so these are ways you can pursue the gifts. And the same with prophecy. You go and start ministering to people and believe that God's going to use you to speak his words through you. And then you find, you talk to somebody, then they're like, oh, you know exactly what's going on in my life. Like, how did you know that? And then you're like, oh, this is what it feels like to hear God and let him speak through you. So by practicing it, it works. And then with healing ministry, it's you go and lay hands, you believe, and then you follow up with them and you either test it immediately. God just said, get up and walk. What do you see? Eyes open. What do you see now? Oh, now I see people walking around, right? So the test that Jesus did was just be healed. By your faith, it's granted to you. Can you see now? Can you walk now? Test it, right? So the testing with healing is, can you see now? Can you walk now? Follow up with them. I'll follow up with people over a week's time too. You still feel good? Do you need more prayer? We need to minister again? Or are you still 100% good? Oh, you're good. Okay. And that inspires your faith too. And then, same with prophecy. It's is what I'm saying resonating with you? And then you're testing. Like one time I just said, I just said, all right, God, teach me how to hear your voice. And while I was praying one day, I believe I was probably in a fast, I was fasting and praying, and I heard God say, Fran's brother has cancer. So I go up to Fran the next day at work, my secretary at work, and I go, you got any siblings? She's like, yeah, I got a brother. I'm like, how's his health? Oh, well, they just told him he had bladder cancer. Right? So you can test these things, right? So I ended up, giving her my number to give to him, and I said, look, tell him, I had a sticky note written down, Fran's brother has cancer. And as soon as she said that, I pull out this sticky note and I'm like, look what I wrote down yesterday. Fran's brother has cancer. And she was like, oh my God. And I was like, give this to your brother. Here's my number. Give it to your brother. Right? He didn't call me though. But it's a sign to her and to me, right? So it's not entirely determined by God. People have to put an effort in. When you step out and do the ministry, God works with you, and you believe he's working with you. It's by his Spirit. The manifestation is of the Spirit. It's not of you, but the Spirit's in you working with you. So you're going to have to step out and pray for people and lay hands on people and talk to people and minister to people, right? Success requires fasting and prayer, confidence, genuine faith that God is going to perform the sign. One neat point is, even the disciples failed to heal someone after being given special authority to heal. So in Matthew 10, Jesus goes, I give you authority to heal the sick and cast out devils. So they have authority. They've been given a special authority to heal the sick and cast out devils. But they needed to fast and pray more to be successful. They go, Lord, why couldn't we heal the boy? This kind comes out with fasting and prayer. So they got special authority. They still failed. They needed to fast and pray. Right? So the answers are there. And it shows that even if you have a special gifting, like the authority given, it doesn't mean it's going to work if you're not in faith. And Jesus got frustrated with them. He goes, you perverse generation, how long do I need to put up with you? Right? He's talking about the disciples. Like, you guys couldn't do this after I've given you authority. You've seen this done 1,000,000 times. You perverse generation, how long do I have to put up with you? He's disappointed with them because they failed where they should have succeeded. So with the special, how much more could you have given them, right? So, again, the failure is on the people there, not necessarily on God determining that boy shouldn't be healed. Because God determined the boy should be healed, because Jesus showed up and healed the boy. And Jesus was disappointed in the disciples for not healing the boy. Therefore, it wasn't determined by God whether they should be healed or not. It was determined on the people's faith. Right? And that's not to say, and I'm not going to go as far as saying someone's not healed because they don't have enough faith. I'm not going to say that to someone, at least, Technically, it's the elders. So if someone's not healed, it's my fault. That's the way I look at it. I don't think you all need to look at it that way, but for me personally, I take responsibility. For me personally, I see myself as the elder who has pursued the gift, who when someone is coming to me for prayer or when I'm going to lay hands on someone, it's not them having not enough faith, it's me. I'm putting myself in the disciples' shoes here. Not the father who said, Lord, help my unbelief. I am putting myself in the disciples' shoes that God expects me to get the job done. In the James 5:14, that you go to the elders of the church for this. So in conclusion, the gifts, what are the gifts? The gifts, people don't become gifted. Gifts are manifestations of the Spirit and grace working through believers who believe and eagerly pursue the gifts. Notice I say believers who believe. That's not redundant. There's believers who believe it and there's believers who don't believe it. You know, if you're praying for your mother's cancer to go away and then you're afraid that she's going to die of cancer, that shows unbelief in you, right? And not that we're not all going to wrestle with that at some level. That is just so human. And it's not like we're not going to wrestle with it, but we have to renew our minds to be more confident than that. And we don't want to have thoughts of, if my mom has cancer, I'm going to be afraid that she's going to die and then God's not going to heal her. You want to renew your mind to believe, God's with me, my mom's going to be all right, because I prayed in faith. And then she's going to get through it, because I prayed in faith, because my God answers when I pray in faith, because that's what the scripture says, because God's heart is good and God is a healer, and that's who God is, and that's who I am, and that's the way it's written. That's the kind of mind renewal you want. This is a wonderful book. In his book, 2,000 Years of Charismatic History, Eddie Hyatt notes episodes of tongues, just like the modern use of tongues, signs, just like those in the Bible, healings, miracles, prophecies, and exorcisms throughout every period of church history from the first century to the present. Now, I'm only halfway through this book, but it is an incredible book. Definitely recommend it for you guys. Anyone interested in this, at least. Wonderful, wonderful book.
And that's the title? 2,000 years.
2,000 Years of Charismatic Christianity, yeah. So it goes through all the revivals. You know, that basically he's like, yeah, the Catholic Church, they didn't see signs, but if you go to the monasteries, the people who fast and pray and dedicate themselves to God, those people saw signs all the time. The monks, yeah, exactly. Yep, the monks were the guys who the signs and gifts worked through. The Catholic Church was secular people looking for secular power. They didn't see a lot of signs. Not that there weren't dedicated Catholics who the signs worked through, just like there are today. But for the most part, the Catholic Church was very secular for a long time and seeking secular power. Not the fasting and praying and giving away your money to the poor sort of people, where the monks were, and the monks saw the results. And so he records all of these kind of like fringe groups that were actually successful in the gifts and some very amazing miracles. And one guy said, there's a boy drowning. He tells his disciple, there's a boy drowning right now. Go get him in the river. This disciple of his goes to the river, runs on the water to get the boy, pulls him out and runs back on the water. That's recorded. Like stuff like that. Incredible. So as far as a charismatic, we're technically continuationists. We don't hear that because only cessationalists use the words continuationalists, and only in this argument do you ever hear the word continuationist. But we're technically continuationists. We believe the gifts are active in the church for those who believe, but not unbelieving believers, right? You got to have faith for it. A lot of scripture to back it up. These are 4 of many. I think Acts 2 is your strongest, and I think I have that on the next slide. Historically, the gifts are recorded through all church history, and no church father ever expected the gifts to cease. Interestingly, Calvin read Augustine, who said the gifts seem to have ceased. And he didn't make a doctrine out of it, but he said, I'm not seeing the gifts here, right? But Augustine later became charismatic. And we actually have a quote in these slides of Augustine using tongues, singing in tongues. The guy later, he saw a bunch of healings and miracles. He became a charismatic at the end of his life. So there are some later records of him that Eddie Hyatt in his book is using. So interestingly, Augustine was kind of the root of Calvin's doctrine of Calvinism and cessationalism, yet Augustine flip-flopped later on, and Calvin must not have read that far through Augustine's writings. Acts 2, and it shall be in the last days, that's now, the last days of the now, church age, God says, I'll pour out my spirit on all mankind, and through your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my bond slaves, both men and women, I will in those days pour forth my spirit, and they shall prophesy, and I'll grant wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth below. So what do you got? You got last days, prophecy, visions, prophecy, and signs, right? So very, very much gives you the timestamp of we're in the last days, and prophecies and signs, right? You got places like Lord's Medical Bureau, which starting in 1883 is now an international committee of 30 medical experts who verify healings by the criteria of the healing being an immediate cure of an incurable disease that has been well medically documented. They've verified 69 cases since 1858. The Bureau has a new name now, and they've been through multiple phases, but you got some examples of a war veteran with epilepsy and paraplegia, bone cancer, a 12-year-old with bone cancer being saved from an amputation, 40 years of paraplegia. So some very credible sources and notable miracles medically verified. And obviously there's a lot more healings than this, but you can't medically verify everything, especially if the healing isn't immediate. Some healings are slower. And especially if it's not well medically documented. And a lot of things you can't prove were incurable, or you can't prove that it was definitely the healing that did it. So to think there's only 69 over the last 150 years. There's a lot more. It's just that it's very hard to actually establish this stuff medically, because some diseases can go into remission or be healed and cured, and so it's hard to make proof of these medically. I mean, but you kind of just, you go with the best you got. So, they can only verify so many by those. This is a very strict criteria. Instant healing of something incurable that's been medically documented that's very strict criteria, and I appreciate them for that, In my personal experience, I'll just list off some of the stuff I've seen. So this is 9 examples of 93 that I recorded in a 4-year time. This was kind of the peak of my healing ministry. I haven't been doing so much healing ministry as of lately, but a torn ligament that needed surgery, I verified that over time. These are things I'd check up with the people over time, make sure they were still doing well. A paralyzed shoulder instantly freed, a woman's ability to walk, hearing loss, endometriosis and a surgically removed ovary reappears, medical records on that. A schizophrenic man was hearing voices. The voices went away. He was better. I followed up with him over time. No more voices. Fresh burns off a child. One leg shorter than the other grew out to be the same length. She was limping too at the time. 3 cases like that. Lupus healed. Medical records verified that. Lupus is considered incurable. Later on, I saw a man, he had a tumor under his skin. He could feel the tumor. It had been there for years. Instantly disappeared. And this, so, the cessationalists don't have people like this in their churches, I wouldn't think. Most of them, if I tell them this stuff, they're just going to call me a liar. And I'm like, well, I got medical records here. I'm a nurse. I have a pretty good idea of medical stuff. And I've got records and yeah, he couldn't move his shoulder, but then he could immediately on the prayer. And others I don't believe you. Or some of them do, and they just say it's not a gift, but I think your doctrine actually matters for your practice in this case. I don't think doctrine always matters for your practice. For example, what you believe about eschatology, about the future, doesn't really impact how you're living your life now. Unless you're not saving up for retirement, which probably isn't wise, but for the most part, it doesn't affect your Christian walk. But this does, I don't think there's many cessationalists who have ministries like this. We'll go into tongues a little bit. You like that? I thought that, yeah, tongues of fire. It's nice, right? You like it? Oh, yeah, you get a picture. All right. The emojis are hilarious. So yeah, we'll talk about tongues a little bit because it's in this, but it's also, tongues is kind of criticized, not just by cessationalists. There's a lot of groups out there that criticize it, but the scripture's really solid on it and history's solid on it. So we'll get into it a little bit. In 1 Corinthians, Paul's correcting Corinth about their use of tongues, but while he's revealing the nature of tongues as he goes. So he's teaching about it, but also correcting, right? So although the context is correctional, he's still giving information that we can pull from it. So, for example, this is skipping about, but just some snippets. Tongues of men and angels. You don't speak to people, but to God, right? So you're not talking some kind of human language that someone can understand. You're uttering mysteries by the Spirit, edifying yourself. So tongues edify you. That means build you up. I wish you all spoke in tongues. My spirit prays. I pray with the Spirit, and tongues are for a sign. So tongues edify you. You're speaking in tongues. You're praying in the Spirit. It's building you up, right? So that's working on you. But he's saying, but he all goes on to correct him. If you're going to pray in tongues in church, like, do it on your own. But if you're going to do it in church, you have to interpret it, because that way you can edify the church and not just yourself. So that's the point. But you get snippets of what the tongues are and the idea of what tongues is throughout this correction. Some people claim tongues were just speaking in another human language. This is false. For example, you get glossa, which is literally a tongue or speaking in tongues, in examples like this. Or on the other hand, in 1 Corinthians 14, you get phonon, which is voice or language. So this phonon's a human language, and it was contrasted against glossa in 1 Corinthians 14, which we see here. There are perhaps a great many kinds of languages, phonon, in the world, and no kind is without meaning. So these languages, these phonon, have meaning. And if we do not know the meaning of the phonon, I will be to the one who speaks a barbarian, and the one who speaks will be a barbarian to me. So, obviously you're not going to understand each other's languages if you don't know the language. So also you, since you're zealous for the spiritual gifts, seek to abound for the edification of the church. Therefore, let the one who speaks in a glossa pray that he may interpret. For if I pray in a glossa, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So, if I'm praying in tongues, my mind is unfruitful. Why? Because I don't understand even the language that I'm saying, but the Spirit is praying. And that's very useful in that it builds you up. The Spirit's praying through you. You're becoming more connected with the Spirit. You're praying according to His will. You're praying, His Spirit's almost praying through you in a way. It's probably a better way to pray. And I always found that the more time I spent in tongues, if I would pray for, years back, I'd have time to pray for an hour a night, and I'd spend a third of that time praying in tongues. And I think that, if you spend maybe gear out a third to half of your prayer time as tongues, I think that's probably a pretty good benchmark, because I really do think it's that helpful and important.
I forget what study this. I have to Google again.
So to summarize that research, they hooked people up, maybe a PET scan, I want to say, but basically they'd see the activity in the brain, where the neural activity was going, while people prayed in tongues. And then they'd contrast that to people praying, people speaking other languages, things like that. What they found was people praying in tongues weren't, the part of the brain that speaks languages was not lighting up. Rather, the part of the brain that is active when you're praying was lighting up. So in speaking in tongues, they were actually in the prayer center of the brain. The prayer part of the brain was active. So the people speaking in tongues are praying.
Well, another thing too, though, when I pray in tongues, which is so great, the edification. Many a times I feel a loss of words, of not being able to express
Exactly what it is.
God. So I speak in tongues to God, and though I don't understand it, there is a total satisfaction in my spirit.
Yeah, it's a great point.
That has been represented.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. Some claim the modern use of tongues was invented in the 1900s, mainly through the Pentecostal movement. But I found research going well before the 1900s. I found records myself, but Hyatt does an exceptional job at this. In that same book, he explains records of many accounts of gifts in tongues through the church history. And these are exactly like the biblical and modern examples of the gifts in tongues. For example, in the 2nd century, Origen says, "To these promises are added a strange, fanatical, and quite unintelligible words of which no rational person can find the meaning." I mean, that is obviously obviously the modern use of tongues, that nobody can understand what the heck anyone's saying. And that's exactly what Paul was saying in the passages we just read, right? In the 4th century, there's Augustine, and from whom is such a jubilation, if not for the ineffable God? For he is ineffable, whom can one cannot express in words. And if you cannot express him in words, and yet you cannot remain silent either, then what is left but to sing in jubilation, so that your heart may rejoice without words, and your unbounded joy may not be confined by the limits of syllables. So there is the late charismatic Augustine, who had, after saying the gifts had seemed to have ceased in the church, comes across charismatics, and he's here singing in tongues. He's singing in, he calls it jubilation. He's singing in syllables that are not words, because you can't express the words, but you can't remain silent either, so you sing in jubilation. He's singing in tongues. Beautiful. Beautiful. 11th century, you got Francis of Assisi. He's speaking in tongues like the modern use, unintelligible words, but also he spoke French sometimes. He didn't know French. He just went and spoke French to people. And I've heard many, even more modern cases. I know in the 1800s there was a woman minister who would just go to immigrants and somehow just know their language and speak it. I know that in this church there was someone praying in tongues, and their uncle from Russia understood their tongues in Russian. So they're speaking in tongues the way they normally do, not knowing what they're saying, not knowing anything about what they're not even trying to speak Russian or trying to speak to anybody. But the man who spoke Russian understood the tongues in Russian, said it was perfectly fluent Russian, and he said, you're talking about the fire of the Spirit coming. And so this happens all the time in the modern use of tongues, that people in other languages will understand it. And I've heard tens and dozens and dozens and dozens of testimonies of this exact thing happening. In the 11th century, Vincent of Ferrier, and then there's a Catherian woman also who spoke in tongues, just like the modern use, and people of other languages understood it as well, just like what I was just explaining. And I haven't gotten further than the 11th century in this book. I've been going pretty slowly through it in my free time, but you've got all of church history. There's the very clear and obvious use of the tongues exactly as we believe and use it today. So it's not some modern invention that the Pentecostals just made it more widely popular. And also, TV, radio, and everything like that made the Pentecostals kind of get this magnifying glass, because what happened in the Pentecostal movement was quite big. And so the media spread it more, where before that time, when it happened, it kind of stayed in these closed systems, but now everything is for the whole world to see. So now, the Pentecostals are the ones who kind of are the front runners of the tongues in the church, but been there all along. Right? It's just that it wasn't advertised and well known because it stayed in these kind of smaller groups who actually believed and functioned in the gifts. And this is a cultural thing. It was in the monks. It was in the Franciscans, the people who followed Francis of Assisi. It was in the followers of these small groups that did it were the people who functioned in these gifts and saw healings and saw miracles and prophesied and had words of knowledge and knew things about people when they ministered and spoke other languages. These were in small collective groups of people who had a culture of the gifts and healing and tongues and prophecy and knowledge. And so if you're around people who believe and function in it, then you're going to believe and function in it too. It's part of a culture because you're pursuing it and believing in it, and you're witnessing it so you can believe in it because you're seeing other people do it. You go, oh, this is real, right? So exposure is a big part of it. Whereas cessationalists, they're just not going to have the exposure, right? And a lot of Christianity does not have any exposure. I'd say 95 to 99% of Christians have zero exposure to any healings or miracles for most of their life. A lot of people have like one story. You talk to any Christian, they got one story. Like, oh yes, my grandmother was really sick one time and I prayed really hard and eventually they weren't sick anymore. It's like, not a super big sign, but they've got a story, and it's like, yeah, they probably shouldn't have beaten that cancer. Like, maybe it was a miracle. It does sound pretty convincing, but it wasn't like a super big thing. But everyone's got one story. But like, to have people who actually go in ministries in this and have people who have story after story after story, that's the real culture of the gifts in the church. And that's what makes it credible too. It's like, I don't just have one story, I've got dozens, And so this is very much culture. You gotta pursue the gifts by immersing yourself in that Christian culture, the culture of the apostles who ministered this way, the biblical culture, what the Bible tells us, what the Bible says we should do, what the Bible said. These signs will follow those who believe. Eagerly pursue the gifts. They'll follow you. The signs will be with you. It's part of who God is. So, excellent book. Excellent witnesses for tongues. Any more comments or questions on this topic before we move on? Curiosity?
People like to heal by when they open to the word.
Some yes, some no. Some of them were just people in the hospital or people on the street. Some of them were family, some were friends, and some were church members. Yep. I never let that be a thing. Like if they're open to the word, they never really had. Like, I don't like making it a thing. I'm not going to say it's not a thing. It's a thing. If you have faith, you're obviously that's going to kind of, two believing together, right? That matters because there's more faith involved, and the person's also cooperating with you, right? But for someone who doesn't have faith, God's still God. Like people always say, Jesus couldn't heal in his hometown. That's not true. If you read the parallel passage, I believe Matthew says he didn't heal anyone, but you read the parallel passage, I think in Mark, it says he only healed a few. So it's not that Jesus didn't heal people in his hometown. He did. It just wasn't a lot. And it's probably because they probably weren't coming to him for healing. And it doesn't even say, but he did heal people, just not a lot. So it's not like it's impossible. I believe if God wants someone healed, he can heal them. I don't think that they're going to, I don't think someone is stronger than God. I don't think someone can strong arm and stop God from doing something. God's sovereign. He can do it, no matter, even if they don't believe. I think the likelihood goes down, but I don't like to go to someone and say they don't believe and then let that stump my faith and bring my faith down. And I find that a lot of people that I talk to in healing ministry, actually, if someone doesn't believe, it's like when I talk to them, it sounds like their faith goes down if the other person doesn't have faith. Don't let that happen. My faith is, I want to keep it strong, and my faith as strong as possible, even if the person doesn't believe, because why not? Why would you allow your own faith to be blunted by someone else's situation and thoughts? And think about this. Jesus raised the dead. Were the dead having faith for themselves? No. Then dead people don't have faith. They're dead. So if you can raise the dead, you can heal someone who isn't having faith for themselves. That's why you go to the elders of the church. If you can't have the faith for yourself, the elder's supposed to have the faith for you. That's why it's set up that way, right? And so you can't just expect everyone to have faith for themselves. It's ultimately the elder minister who's supposed to be, who I see as being responsible. It was the apostles responsible. Jesus didn't say, "Oh, father of this young man who's demonized, it's your fault for your unbelief." No. He was mad at the disciples for not healing the boy, right? And the man just flat out said, "Help my unbelief." And Jesus says, "Believe. All things are possible for those who believe," right? And then he healed the boy. So, don't let anything blunt your faith. And yeah, I mean, ultimately it's easier if someone has faith, but I never make a thing out of it because I want to keep it practical.
The end goal, too, was Jesus was telling the disciples to make more disciples
Yeah.
of everyone. And he was like, well, we can do this in my name, we can do this in my name,
Yeah.
this in my name. But the end goal is to bring them to me.
Right.
So why would you only go after, if you're in a healing ministry, why would you only go after people who already heal?
It's a great point. Yeah, you do want to go for unbelievers for healings because, yeah, it does. If it works, you bring them to faith. And heck, even if it doesn't work, isn't it nice to pray for people? Even if it doesn't work, don't you still get the opportunity to witness to them, even if it doesn't work? It's just part of ministry. Don't make it about, it's about healing or it's not about, it's whether they healed or not is success or failure. The end goal, the body's going to die no matter what. The end goal is the person inside the body that you're healing. The healing's great. Maybe it'll make their life better. Maybe it'll elongate their life. But the end goal is the person's soul. So as long as you keep, that's a great point, Brady. As long as you keep that focus in mind, that this is about bringing people to God, bringing people closer to God, as long as that's your goal, it's always a success whether you see the results or not.